Good evening. In his first 24 hours back in power, Donald Trump began his targeting of the arts and culture in the United States, which has included eliminating federal funding, imposing ideological control, and reshaping American cultural institutions to align with his political viewpoint. His 2026 budget seeks to completely defund and eliminate the National Endowment for the Arts, the National Endowment for the Humanities, and the Institute of Museum and Library Services, lifelines for cultural institutions across the United States and the very backbone of the United States cultural infrastructure. His administration has cruelly rescinded already awarded arts and culture grants, leaving theaters, local museums, and galleries facing sudden funding gaps and uncertainty over expenses for work already underway. Trump has set in place mechanisms to impose a narrow, politicized definition of what he calls patriotic art. After his tour of the Smithsonian's National Museum of African American History and Culture, Trump called it, quote, out of control, adding, quote, everything discussed in his exhibits is how horrible our country is, how bad slavery was, end quote, leaving many wondering what exactly Trump saw as the upsides of slavery. He fired the nonpartisan board of the John F. Kennedy Center for the Performing Arts and appointed himself the chair, leading to significant staff cuts and a climate of fear. In his crusade against the larger cultural sector, he has fired the U.S. Archivist, the Librarian of Congress, and the director of the National Portrait Gallery. Not satisfied with attacking just the Smithsonian's National Museum of African American History and Culture, he broadened his target to the entire Smithsonian Institution, the world's largest collection of museums and education and research complex, and issued orders to remove what he deems, quote, improper ideology, end quote. I'm Jim Turk, director of the Center for Free Expression, and this evening we are going to discuss what these unprecedented attacks on arts and culture in the United States mean for Canada and for our artists and writers and cultural organizations. But before I begin and introduce our impressive panel, I want to acknowledge that the land in which I am speaking to you tonight is the traditional territory of many nations, the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis. I also want to thank our co-sponsors for tonight's panel, Mass Culture and PEN Canada. Now our panel. Our first panelist is Jordan Laffrenier. Jordan is the Associate Artistic Director at Canadian Stage and the Prime Mover Theatre Company, who recently directed Canadian Stage's powerhouse performance of Slave Play. Jordan has held many theater development roles in New York City, Los Angeles, and Toronto. Welcome, Jordan.
Thank you so much for having me, Jen.
I'd like to introduce our second panelist. He is Sascha Priewe, who is the Director of Collections and Public Programs at the ICOM Museum and President of the International Council of Museums, Canada. Welcome, Sascha.
Pleased to be here.
Our third panelist is Robin Stevenson. Robin is an award-winning author of more than 30 books of fiction and nonfiction for kids and for teens. And she was the Book and Periodical Council's Champion of Free Expression in 2022. Welcome, Robin.
Thanks, Jim. Happy to be here.
And moderator for this group is Brendan Caries. Brendan is the Executive Director of PEN Canada. Welcome, Brendan.
Thank you, Jim. Pleasure to be here.
The format for tonight's panel is the panel will have a conversation amongst themselves for 45 to 55 minutes or so, after which we're going to turn to the audience for a Q&A session for the remainder of the time. In this version of Zoom, we don't use the chat, but there is a Q&A button if you look down at the bottom of your screen. And what we encourage you in the audience to do is you're listening to the panelists, if a question comes to mind that you would like to ask them or something you want them to elaborate on or something you want to question whether it's right or not, just write out click on the Q&A button and write out your question as you're listening to it. Don't wait till Brendan turns to Ange Holmes, who's the coordinator of our center and who's going to be monitoring the questions as they come in. he's going to turn to her at some point and ask her to read out the first question. But please record your questions as you think of them, rather than waiting till we get to the Q&A button or the Q&A section of the event. That's all from me. Over to you, and look forward to hearing your conversation.
Thank you, Jim. I thought I'd begin with a very quick overview. Jim has mentioned quite a few of the major initiatives. But generally, over the last 10 months, the administration has shown a very decisive attitude towards confronting, controlling, defunding, and dismantling cultural institutions that don't accord with its worldview. It's dressed up these initiatives as a patriotic war on woke, removing divisive cultural narratives. And as you heard, it went after the Kennedy Center, the National Archivist. In March, the sort of flavor of the mood in the White House can be gauged by the executive order that Trump signed before they mandated a review of the Smithsonian Institution. It was called Restoring Truth and Sanity to American History. And that's the one in which J.D. Vance was empowered to remove improper ideology from all areas of the institution, including museums, education, and research centers, even the National Zoo. In May, he went after the Librarian of Congress and the National Portrait Gallery, and he announced in advance that he was going to fire the head, Kim Saget, who had been there for 12 years. He did not actually have the legal authority to do that. But interestingly, just that announcement was enough to put sufficient pressure on her to lead to her ouster. And then in October, the director of the Eisenhower Presidential Library was told to resign or be fired after he resisted a plan by the administration to give one of President Eisenhower's sword, which was the property of the library and therefore the property of the American people, as a gift to King Charles when Trump was visiting the UK. In addition to this, of course, there have been high-profile attempts to cancel critical late-night television hosts, Stephen Colbert and Jimmy Kimmel. So it's a sort of all-fronts attack on parts of the culture that the Trump administration does not like. Now, given the sort of full spectrum interests that they've shown, I thought I'd begin by asking you, how have your specific sectors been affected by this situation within the United States? Sascha, let's go with you first.
Thank you, Brandon, and good evening. Yeah, your list of items really reminded me that it's quite hard to keep track. At times, there's been actually quite indeed a lot of moves that have been, I think, fairly characterized as unprecedented, both in their pace and in their intensity. And so allow me to help set the stage a bit by diving a bit deeper into what's happening in the museum sector specifically. And I'll begin with the Smithsonian. And as a trained archaeologist, I'm going to do it in chronological order so that we at least understand what started, although we don't have the end quite yet. And it began in March with an executive order titled, as Brandon has mentioned, Restoring Truth and Sanity to American History, which was about removing content deemed divisive or anti-American. This was then followed up in June by a statement by the Smithsonian's Board of Regents. They reinforced the independence of the institution, indicated that personnel decisions lie with the secretary of the Smithsonian, and that was in reaction to the moves to ouster Kim Saget. They also emphasized the nonpartisanship of the institution. And I'm trying to quote a few pertinent aspects because it's good to have this in the original expression. And the next, what I say next is a quote. The Smithsonian is a, quote, beacon of scholarship free from political or partisan influence, and we recognize that an institution can and must do more to further these foundational values, end quotes. And I further state, quote, that they have to give directors reasonable time to make any needed changes to ensure unbiased content and to report back to the board on progress and any needed personnel changes based on success or lack thereof in making the needed changes, end quote. So, and what is quite remarkable is that, of course, the Smithsonian, which is not reporting to the White House, but actually is uh, funded by appropriation from Congress directly, has a highly political board. The Chief Justice of the Supreme Court sits on it, as does the Vice President ex officio, as well as 3 senators and 3 Congress members of the House of Representatives. And these across the stripes, in addition to another set of board members. So it's quite remarkable that they came out with that statement. Then it was quiet until August, which was then followed by two moves. The first move was the release by the White House of a document that listed examples from 7 museums that were seen as, quote, overly negative portrayals of US history, end quote. And there was a relatively long laundry list of exhibitions and activities that were fitting that characterization. And then the White House followed this up with a letter to the Secretary of the Smithsonian in the same month to request to start a review of exhibits, operations, and so on. And I think after a meeting at the White House between the president and the secretary, the Smithsonian then set up its own internal team to respond. And the main thrust of this was to ensure that programming is neither partisan and remains factual. And yeah, so this is what's happened at the Smithsonian. It's been relatively quiet since August. There have been a few reactions in the article since September, but it's been, yeah, I would say quiet. But this in the museum sector, this is not the only institution that's been affected. There's also Institute of Libraries and Museums that is one of the main funding agencies, especially of libraries, museums as well, but maybe I think to a lesser extent, as far as I understand. And a March executive order that took aim at reducing elements of the bureaucracy requested that this institute was be reduced as well in effort of over reduction of the scope of the federal bureaucracy. And the latest that I could find is that this effort was halted by an injunction. I couldn't find whether this was actually being enforced or not, but consequences have already happened, and I go into this in a moment. And then we've seen cuts to the National Endowment for the Arts and National Endowment for the Humanities. And this has resulted in loss of funding. And the American Alliance of Museums, which is the main museum association, National Museum Association in the United States, recently conducted a survey to look at the impacts of those measures. And they report canceled government contracts, unreimbursed expenditures, but canceled grants were the most common, both all across the IMLS, the NEH, and the NEA. And the median loss that was reported is $30,000, which may not be much for some of the big institutions, but for smaller institutions, and the museum world is happily littered with smaller institutions. For them, of course, loss of funding, even $5,000 can be a hard hit. And that funding so far has not yet been replaced by others. So we've seen then a reduction in programming and also the cancellation of programming. And I think that's where we stand at present.
We'll come back to that later. As you may recall, there was a Guyanese-Canadian artist who was disinvited from the Museum of the Americas quite early on in the Trump administration. There was sort of anticipation that it would not be viewed well because there was a queer theme to the exhibit, and that was cancelled. And I'm quite interested in how that sort of chill spreads through the sector.
Yeah.
But I'd like to move on quickly to Robin. The book situation, you and I have discussed this before. Could you give me a sort of overview of what it's like now in the 10 months into the Trump administration?
Sure, yeah. So book banning in the US didn't obviously begin with the Trump administration. It has been escalating since, I guess, post-pandemic. PEN America has recorded over 22,000 book bans in the US over the last 4 years. And these bans are often framed as protecting children, as advancing parental rights. The group that's been most affected by them is teens. The majority of the books that have actually been pulled from shelves have been pulled from the shelves in school libraries. And there are some highly coordinated, funded far-right groups like Moms for Liberty that circulate these lists of books to challenge. They run folks for school board candidates promoting really extremely conservative ideas. They spread misinformation about the books. And what we had seen was a huge number of complaints being submitted by a relatively small number of people. Again, this mostly targets public school libraries. PEN America has referred to it as the ed scare, but it's now also spread to public libraries, and is also now has been also at the level of state level legislation over the last couple of years with Florida, for example, with the Don't Say Gay law, with different states bringing forward these statewide book ban lists. And spreading to public libraries as well, with some states having policies that limit access to particularly LGBTQ plus books for people who are 18 plus. So states where you can't check out books with LGBTQ plus characters on a child's library card. What we're now seeing with the Trump administration is that those bans are being reinforced at the federal level. So we're seeing executive orders like ending radical indoctrination in K-12 schools that are echoing the same book banning rhetoric that we've been hearing from these groups like Moms for Liberty. And then these executive orders are used as justification for removing books. We just saw, I think, nearly 600 books removed from schools on military bases. Again, almost all 600 are books by or about Black, Indigenous authors, LGBTQ plus authors, or about civil rights, about Black history, books that touch on social justice or activism in any way. LGBTQ plus content is also repeatedly targeted and labeled as sexually explicit. There was a Supreme Court case in this last year, which one of my picture books was caught up in, called Mahmoud v. Taylor, in which the Supreme Court found that the use of books with LGBTQ plus characters without explicit parental consent or without giving parents the right to opt out infringed on the religious rights of parents. So again, that's a Supreme Court finding that's likely to further fuel book bans across the United States. And of course, all of this is then creating this climate of fear, this climate of intimidation, because the books that are being targeted are books in school libraries and in public libraries. It's very much tied in with these attacks on schools and libraries as institutions. A lot of teachers and librarians being targeted very personally, with hate campaigns, being called groomers, being accused of giving pornography to children, and all of that resulting in a lot of overcompliance. So a lot of the books that are being pulled are actually being pulled kind of preemptively because of this culture of intimidation that's being created and this fear of backlash. And then that self-censorship also affecting which books are purchased in the first place, which books are shelved in the first place, which books are faced out in displays. There's just a lot of fear. And then, of course, a concern that is then potentially going to affect publishing in terms of acquisitions, because if these books are not selling, and for children's books, the largest part of the market is the educational market, a fear that that's then going to affect what books are acquired and what books are published. Authors, of course, are also affected very directly by this fear and by this pressure to self-censor. There's PEN documented over 2,500 authors and illustrators who've been affected by book bans in the last year alone. And some of the impacts of that include reduced royalties due to book sales declining, lost income due to school visits. For many authors, school visits actually are a significant amount of their income. And that's become increasingly difficult for marginalized authors and authors whose books have been targeted in bans. And of course, creative self-censorship as well, as people sort of struggle with what to write and whether they'll be able to place the stories that they're hoping to share. And like with librarians and teachers, I think also fear of backlash that authors in the US, particularly marginalized authors, are dealing with backlash, with online hate, with harassment, with review bombing, one-star reviews saying horrible things about the author and about the book, personal attacks and threats, and all of that, of course, can also lead to self-censorship.
You've anticipated about 5 things I wanted us to get into later. So before I delve into those, let's go to Jordan. Can you tell us a bit about the plays and film and theatre sector?
Yes, the story is really similar in the theater sector as it is in the other two sectors. What we're experiencing is a president who built his presidency on white nationalism and Christian nationalism, using funding to reshape what stories are told and how they're told. And he's adjusting policies, he's adjusting funding measures. And what we're seeing is changes in the ways that theater operates and the ways that playwrights operate within the theater industry.
Right. Well, I'd like to delve into that a little. But I'm going to go back to what Robin mentioned and Sascha mentioned, which is there seems to be a war of attrition being waged by many of these conservative critics coming after liberal institutions. So, for example, the review of the Smithsonian has requested a level of documentation, emails, plans, and so on, that is unworkable. It is almost like a discovery process in a complex criminal trial. In Florida, as you know, Robin, there are people who launch 3,600 challenges against books. And even if these are in bad faith, they still have to be processed, which paralyzes the institution. Sort of question to all of you, how effective has that tactic been? Because it seems to me if you know in advance that a controversial topic is going to trap you in reviews and litigation and explanations, it's achieved its purpose. You will naturally self-censor, which is a far more appealing end game for the people making these initiatives. I wonder what your thoughts are on that. Jordan, let's begin with you.
I'm still. I'm going to think
Still
about
processing.
it.
What, Robin?
I mean, I think you're right. I think self-censorship is not a side effect. I think it is the goal. That the aim of a lot of this is to silence people, is to make people stop trying to share the stories that they're sharing. I think there's a huge amount of resistance. I don't know how many, certainly among authors. I do know some authors who have stopped writing for children because being repeatedly called a groomer and a pedophile and accused of pushing pornography for children and all of that is pretty hard to take. But I think I know far many more who are continuing to write the books they want to write, and hoping that they are still able to publish them. So I think there's, a lot of resistance, and certainly, like on all levels, it's the same with librarians and teachers. There's a lot of fear. There's also a lot of people who are really pushing back and strategizing and trying to find ways to continue. Not over complying, not complying in advance, continuing to find ways to commit to having diverse books on the shelves for students. Um, so I think there's both of those things happening at the same time.
Could you say just a little bit about the relative strength of emerging authors versus established authors? Because this is quite a big issue in Canada, certainly. If you're a first-time author and you're writing about a niche experience, being gay, black, ethnic minority, sexual minority, you're far less likely to have the resources to meet a challenge to your book, whether that's just institutional or legal. And that means that it's much easier to exert a chill on the lower rungs of the literary ecosystem. Is that your experience? And is that so?
I mean, I think authors are often not actually that directly involved in challenges to our books. No one tells an author when their book's been challenged. You're not required to respond in any way. I don't know anyone who has mounted any kind of legal response. It's just your book is pulled from the shelves, and you can decide if that's something you want to speak out about and engage with media about or not. I think that publishing is so slow. I mean, publishers that are acquiring books now are often signing books for 2028, 2029. So in terms of what the impact is on acquisitions, that's hard to tell. The books that are getting published now are books that were probably signed 3 years ago. So it is hard to have a sense of what this is going to mean in terms of which books are being acquired and which books may be having a harder time finding publishers. But I think for sure, as a emerging writer, the sort of fears about backlash, and you may not be as well connected in terms of support. I know for me, when I've been dealing with book challenges, particularly ones like the Supreme Court situation that had a huge amount of publicity, it has been incredibly important to have the support, not just of my publisher, but of a group of peers. And as an emerging writer, you may not be as connected with writing community, so it may be harder to get that kind of support and to get the information about sort of responding to challenges. And I mean, I think that's probably true, in all sectors, and with all kinds of challenges, that if you're newer to a field, you may not have the resources or as many connections that you can draw on.
Sascha, how true is that in the museum world? I mean, if you can go after the Smithsonian and you can tell the African American Museum not to put so much emphasis on slavery, what chance do smaller institutions have?
Well, if I may shaft a speculation about what's happening at potentially other institutions across the US, I mean, we should first recognize the United States is huge. It's heavily decentralized as well. Most museums, unlike in any other parts of the world, are heavily privately funded and are less reliant on government funding. So we need to understand those dynamics as well to see how power centers are actually heavily distributed across the country as well. So I'd like to stay with the Smithsonian for a moment because last week, in my role as the president of ICOM Canada, I had the pleasure of attending the ICOM General Conference in Dubai, where 4,500 museum professionals from all over the world congregated to come together and share perspectives and narratives, elect a new ICOM board, and so on. And there, a senior official from the Smithsonian actually gave a keynote lecture. A keynote lecture actually named after Stephen Weil, one of the eponymous museum scholars or museum researchers who was doing his career at the Smithsonian actually, and wrote key texts on the pivot of museums from being about something to being for somebody. So key intellectual voice in broadening the scope and inclusivity of the museum field. So that lecture was named in his honor and was carried out there by a Smithsonian official. And it was so interesting how she was emphasizing the semi-quincentennial. I was practicing this earlier because it's been been used. The 250th anniversary of the United States that's happening next year, and how this has been the focal point of much of this. It's about what kind of history should be presented for that period. And so she gave us a bit of an insight in how the Smithsonian has been grappling with this. And she started with the, well, first of all, with focusing us all around this semi-quincentennial as the central rallying point around this, and for which history is being reviewed, as it were. And then she talked about trust. And museums, of course, in any survey that you can pick up, are just below friends and family in terms of most trusted institutions in society. This has been, I mean, true for so many years. And the reason why, and let me just pull up the reasons that contributed to level of trust, because that is key to the argument that the Smithsonian has been making, is that museums are seen as fact-based. They're seen as presenting real, original, authentic objects, and they're also research-oriented. And they're seen as, and of course that's been widely debated, but they're seen as offering independent and objective information, right? So trust, they're imbued with trust because the way in which they approach subject matter. And that's why in the response from the Board of Regents, from Lonnie Bunch directly, Lonnie Bunch is the Secretary of the Smithsonian, you see this emphasis on non-partisanship, fact-based research orientation. And that's really what the Smithsonian has been doubling down on. But it was quite interesting that how, in order to drive those narratives, the Smithsonian is not reviewing how it presents those narratives. It's to safeguard the trust. Because if, due to political pressure, they were just to change the narratives, that would potentially undermine that trust. So the speaker was outlining ways in which the Smithsonian trying to address historical interpretation and so on. It was very fascinating. And this is about including even more people into the narrative. This is not about validating one side over the other. This is for them not about throwing away all the important progress that actually has been made in museum field. Yes, we're not quite there yet, but we have made much progress. It's fully understood. And one of the ways, and that she adduced there, was museums should drop the jargon. And how did she refer to this was quite memorable. If it takes a college course to explain a term, don't use it in your exhibition texts. Try to find ways to explain, to describe what is going on, what you want to say without that jargon, because jargon is often coded in a certain way or in charged. But if you try to describe what you're trying to say in a very different way that drops this jargon, you might actually find more agreement. And then also, of course, one element that she has to check for one-sidedness. Is the museum, in the way it's been presenting information, inadvertently excluding other narratives that should also find a presence or something like that? I found it also quite interesting, and we can discuss, of course, who has been excluded, who's actually being excluded, who's included. That's quite interesting discussion to be had. And also, she talked about how the museums has been suffering from bad timing. There was a bit of a flurry I think it was in August, when something was removed and that timing aligned in some way with the White House moves in August, and was seen in reaction to those, when in fact a loan was simply coming to an end and the work needed to be returned to the lender, and which is a fairly standard museum process. Timing was not fortuitous. And so she suggested that we need to actually explain as a sector, and especially as a Smithsonian, how these processes work, what they're actually doing to not to fall prey to this. Not quite sure. People will listen to long museums 101 lectures about lending and conservation requirements of works of art and so on. I doubt that, but I was quite interested that that is how they are with 3D. There were also a bunch of other principles, but that's how the Smithsonian apparently is approaching the way in which they will be presenting information for next year for the semi-quincentennial.
I'd like to come back to that in a while because I would like to hear what Jordan has to say. But I do pause when I hear that because I think that there is a gap there in the nature of the sort of bad faith way that the administration has moved. Of course, there are competing cultural narratives. Of course, there's always a battle for inclusion and new voices. But the way that the Trump administration has gone after sort of overturning the 1619 narrative or the 1776 narrative. One, there are many ways you could have done that, and it seems to me they've done it in supreme bad faith. They've responded to something they don't like propagandistically and not with anything like this level of scruple that you just outlined that a museum would approach. How is this narrative told? Who's included? And so, anyway, Jordan, can we just ask you a little bit about how these issues are played out in the theater?
Yeah, I think certainly censorship is a big issue, and I agree with Robin that it's one of the goals. I think ultimately, what a lot of this with a lot of the attack on arts and culture is trying to do is reduce our ability to imagine collective futures. And what small theater companies are so good at is tapping into what is happening locally and how we can respond to that on a more national level. And when these threats against culture and funding happen, their ability to create narratives that are true and speak to the community are greatly diminished. And also, you know, as is being pointed to, the ability to trust them is being diminished. And so what we see is audiences also turning away from them because their value in society is being questioned, and thus they're making more populist work in order to attract a greater audience. But I don't think that's true necessarily across the board. We're also seeing a lot of companies, as Robin was also pointing to, that are really resistant. I think of the Public Theater Company, who, when DEI came into question, they doubled down on their DEI mandate and reemphasized it. And so I think the story is, evolving.
Well, I'd like to move us on a little bit to what do you think the impact has been on the corresponding sectors within Canada? How have these illiberal tendencies affected Canadian theatre companies, museums, writers? Let's go in reverse order. So Jordan, Robin, Sascha.
Yeah, I think with theater in Canada, the two big impacts have been financial and cultural. And so the impact on finances has largely come because of tariffs. The state of theater was already just holding on after COVID and because of inflation. And so introducing any kind of increased costs has been incredibly hard on theater institutions. And so what we're seeing is a lot of theaters contracting, especially smaller theaters. And then the other way is with culture. And as I mentioned before, I think the thing that Trump is trying to control is not only what stories are told, but who's telling the story. And what we're seeing is less and less work being produced by people of color, by queer writers, by trans writers, and by Indigenous writers, and more work being produced that can speak to a wider and wider audience.
Robin?
Yeah, so I think for authors and for illustrators, because our books are sold both in Canada and the US, there's the sort of direct impact that our books are being challenged in the United States. So for that recent list of almost 600 books that were banned in schools on military bases across the US, I believe there were about 20 Canadian books on that list. So including a couple of mine, including a couple by Black Canadian authors. I think for some people that was probably the first time one of their books had been banned, and the fact that it happened in the U.S. doesn't lessen the impact of them on them as a Canadian creator. So the impacts that American writers are experiencing in terms of reduced sales, difficulty getting school visits, those things are true for Canadian writers whose books are sold into the United States as well. And if you're a Canadian writer and your book is banned in the States, there's also the possibility of that being then targeted in American right-wing media. And so there's a huge amount of online hate that can go along with that, which again further then affects the writer's abilities to get school visits and so on, because it becomes a bit of a bit of a red flag. There's a bit of a concern that if we invite this particular author whose book has been challenged multiple times, we're going to have pushback. It feels like a risk for people. So there's a very direct impact for Canadian writers and illustrators whose books are challenged in the US. And then beyond that, I think there's this spread of book bans in Canada as well. And so the same things that we're seeing in the US, we're starting to see here. So just this morning, I got an email from a teacher librarian who wanted to talk to me about the fact that a lot of her colleagues are now talking about being afraid to put LGBTQ plus books on the shelves in schools in their district because they're really worried about backlash. And there's been a huge escalation in challenges to LGBTQ plus books over the last couple of years. And again, it's often teachers and librarians who find themselves on the front lines. As in the States, we have far right, often Christian nationalist groups in Canada who are pushing anti-LGBTQ, anti-immigrant, xenophobic, anti-Muslim rhetoric. Pushing for book bans. So we have groups like Action for Canada and Parents for Choice in Education who are very much following the US playbook, and who, when Alberta announced their plan to ban books in Alberta schools, they claimed victory for that. And I worry that there's also just a bit of a normalization of this idea of book bans in schools. Last week, there was an article in the media about an Alberta school district which has pulled 6 books from the shelves. And there hasn't really been any media reporting on that. The names of the books hasn't been released. I don't know what which 6 books were banned. But to me, it's really concerning that a Canadian school district just banned 6 books, and there's not a whole lot of public conversation about that. I think that's not something that should get normalized, and that it's really dangerous if we start allowing books just to disappear from the shelves with no pushback. And that pushback may be happening behind the scenes, but I certainly haven't seen any of that in the media. So I think that we're seeing a lot of the same stuff starting to happen in Canada that we're seeing in the States. And as in the States, it's marginalized authors that are and illustrators. And I want to emphasize illustrators because in Alberta right now is particularly focusing on images rather than words in which books they're pulling. So I think, graphic novels, comics, and so on are very much going to be a target. So definitely a lot of the concerns about what's happening in the States slipping into our schools in Canada.
Sascha?
So Robin said earlier that her sector is moving so slowly. I think I can beat that.
Mhm.
The museum, and I think we'll see there will be much more of a time lag to see how this is going to manifest, and it is at times too early to know for sure at this point in time. I could see that, and I could see potentially that the curtailing of funding might mean fewer collaboration with Canadian institutions, or but generally the museum sector is less dependent on the trade, um, less dependent on audiences in this building audiences in this way. It takes a huge effort to travel exhibitions, and unless you have a fully developed program that does so, um, you are less dependent on cultural trade, as it were. And also, and I think in the performing arts, it's much more fluid in terms of the movement of artists across border, and of course that's been affected. I mean, it sits alongside massive visa challenges we focus across the world actually at the moment, and in the performing arts in general. But uh, my my question is actually to what extent could that discourse that we see spill over into Canada, or manifest itself in certain ways in Canada, or manifest itself in certain pressures. Um, I think it's been more obvious on this in the side of books, as Robin just described, and but we have not seen this yet on the museum side in the same way. So my question is actually to how will the Canadian museum sector react to this? So far, there's been very little reaction or very little effect. The tariffs surely have manifested at times in price hikes, but not as deeply, especially since now the Canadian retaliatory tariffs have been removed. I think that will not normalize price levels, but at least bring them back to a level that is potentially within affordability. Um, I could also see Canadian artists actually pulling out of exhibitions in the US. I think that's entirely possible, and we've seen anecdotal evidence for this also at museums that are outside of the Smithsonian, where shows were either canceled, delayed, or artists pulled out directly. Um, and actually, it might be great to have a discussion later on to see um, to what extent we should be continue work with the US or not. And I can say upfront already that I'm very keen to keep working with US, keep working with our many partners in the US. I think it's very important. Um, but I could see that um, some people in the field might be quite reluctant to do so, or more cautious at least at this point in time. But in terms of large scale effects or direct effects, it's still quite too early to tell.
Well, I want to sort of ask a macro question because it seems to me that this is all tied up with the economic entanglement of the two countries. And however determined the resistance is within a particular sector in Canada, there are economic realities that take their toll over time. So, for example, if banks and institutions that have cross-border relationships of economic significance are under significant pressure to drop DEI programs, to drop their indulgence, so to speak, of LGBTQ narratives and so on. Isn't it only a question of time before their Canadian counterparts are forced to yield? I'm interested in what your take is, because all of you are in sectors that, to some extent or another, rely on that sort of support. So, what are the consequences of resisting? What are they like at that level, at the level of donors and sponsors and so on? Anyone jump in on that? Because is this a quixotic battle, given the economic disparity between the two countries?
If I may jump in, I think we are so far getting very mixed reports from the US in terms of how um, how institutional funding has or has not been shifting. You've heard some reports about how some foundations, for example, have already adapted language and program focus away from what they funded previously. On the other side, I've heard reports about how many foundations actually have doubled down, but gone more quietly about it. So I think that it's still quite mixed even in the US in terms of what the reaction has been and whether you call it resistance or not. But there has been, yeah, I still think the funders are still figuring this out, how to position themselves.
Jordan, any thoughts?
Yeah, I think many things. There's many possible outcomes. But I think that what's important is for an organization to continue to look at what it values and to make the appropriate changes in order to continue to uphold its values. And so, my hope is that even if there is a funding gets pulled from a specific institution that doesn't necessarily align with the way the institution is moving, that the company would continue to find alternative funding sources and progress.
Well, the obvious replacement there is the government. So I'd be quite interested to ask you what role you think government funding and government institutions should play in responding to this dilemma. Is it increased funding for the arts? Is it a comprehensive review so that things align with, so to speak, Canadian values? What are the sort of menu of options and how have they been considered and acted on within your various worlds?
I think government has an opportunity to set the narrative and set the narrative that they want to set. And I think part of the narrative that I hope that the government would want to set is that art institutions matter, that a corruption of institutions, especially arts institutions, is a step towards tyranny and fascism, and that what the Trump administration is so good at is exasperating issues that are so identity focused and so focused on putting people into isolation chambers and not focused on issues that are collective, like the housing crisis.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm really inspired right now by the Irish government that just got elected, and how they focused on housing issues, and actually, the populist government didn't win. And so, across Europe, we keep seeing these populist governments win. In America, we've seen a populist government win. We nearly saw a populist government win here. But actually, when we focus on the issues that create a kind of collective imagination and consciousness, I think we have the ability to move forward.
Yeah. Did either of you have anything there, Robin, Sascha?
I just like to take a brief step back because I think Adam Tooze put it really well in a podcast a few weeks ago. He said, well, the moment you look in the mirror, you see Trump looming large, and then you don't see the matter at hand. There's always Trump, right? And so I've been thinking about, the fact that Canadian cultural policy has actually been, since the Massey Commission and before that, has been framed in opposition to the weight of the United States. And that, I think, Brendan, gets to your point about, to what extent are these dependencies actually going to affect us? And there's been some provocative pushes recently when it comes to looking at the economic independence. I think Ian Bremmer faced it quite interestingly recently, where he said, okay, look at the economic hardwiring north to south rather than east to west, which de facto deprives Canada of its sovereignty in so many ways, at least economically. And I found it quite provocative. So I've been thinking about, okay, to what does it actually mean for the cultural sector? To what extent are we hardwired? Not all of us, but certainly many parts of Canada at least certainly the English-speaking parts of Canada, hardwired into the U.S. economy in a similar fashion, and trade diversification, as it were, might not come to play here. And so I'm quite interested in these bigger picture questions which are not not new as of January 20th. They have long formed the way in which cultural policy has been articulated at the national level for sure, less so at the provincial level. Provincial level had its own historically have their own narratives to contend with, but certainly federally, this has been a major thrust. And of course, what's currently happening around Canadian content rules with the CRTC is an expression of that, and how to think that forward into the digital realm. The way in which certain types of funding has been allocated or reallocated or tightened in the recent budget under the umbrella of overall funding cuts, though. So we need to judge how effective that or efficient that is if the overall pot is being reduced. So I think there is the current government south of the border notwithstanding. I think there's a bigger discussion to be had around what does it mean. And in late September, I did a panel around cultural security at the Kuching conference that we held at my museum. And the question that I asked is basically, to what extent is cultural policy de facto made in Silicon Valley? To what extent are we talking a lot about how much a theater or a museum or artists are funded to our system, whether that's enough or whether that creates enough supply of Canadian content, Canadian art, when the country is actually hooked on platforms, decisions about which the algorithms and so on are made elsewhere, and the consequence on the culture which we can spell out. So I think there's bigger questions we also need to think through and address. And some of these, yes, they are part of the dependencies, Bren, that you indicated earlier, but I think there are actually long-standing historical issues that need to be unpicked.
I think that's absolutely fascinating. I mean, you can look at the wrangling over TikTok through that lens. In India, they banned it, I believe. The idea that a platform could be delivering 1 billion hours of attention or demanding 1 billion hours of attention every week, month, whatever it is, that is a massive cultural shift that you have little or no control over if you are beholden to a global infrastructure that enables platforms to enter and exit your culture at will. So to what extent do you think there is an opportunity here to rethink the way that we process Canadian issues, Canadian things, and to decouple, as it were, from the American culture wars that these sorts of things are dragging us into? I think it's a really fascinating question that you've raised there, Sascha. Anyone, sorry.
Yeah, I wish we had someone from the publishing industry on the panel, because I feel like there's probably a lot of issues here for Canadian publishers that I can't really speak to. But I think that I'm sure that there's a lot of questions that are coming up. And I mean, this is true whether it was around the sort of tariffs, but also just around the size of the US market and how dependent Canadian publishers are on selling into that market, and what the challenges are, even around promotion and so on, and taking part in conferences and events in the United States with book publishing. Those markets are so intertwined, and I would love to hear somebody sharing more from a publishing perspective, but I'm not really able to speak to that.
Jordan, anything?
I'm curious what Sascha has to say.
Well, I think the dilemma that we're facing collectively is indeed what someone called that underground empire, the way in which the economic hardwiring is literally determining the flow of things, right? And it's from banking to trade to financial system and so on, and also the way in which the global consumption of culture has actually been shaped, especially Cold War, in terms of our assumption that the end of history assumption of democracies. Of course, that's now, this rug is now being heavily pulled out from under feet in a lot of places. But generally, this kind of understanding of the post-Cold War liberal international order, the trading system that underpins it, and the hegemonic nature of the United States. And this is very much determined the way in which you look at globalization, the way in which neoliberalism has actually shaped the narratives in the cultural sector as well, the way in which we have consumed and agreed to those narratives to be subsumed under those narratives. And why I'm slightly punting with this answer is just because we're in a phase now where all of these things are shifting. And the shift has been underway certainly since the financial crisis in 2008, but now being heavily certainly one could argue pushed off the cliff more recently, but it's something that's been underway a bit longer. And we're now in this really curious interim period where we're still functioning with an understanding of the previous order, whereas the order is shifting. So we have an existing hardware, and we're trying to run the same software, but this is changing in front of our eyes, right? So are we changing? How's the hardware changing? How's the software changing how the system is being run? And I'm quite fascinated by this because we need to completely rethink potentially the way we think about these questions. And so I think in Canada, from a cultural policy perspective, it's been more iterative around how much Canadian content is available on the radio and what points we give out to what counts as a book with Canadian and things like that, right? Whereas I think we might have to more fundamentally rethink where all of this is going if the system to which we've been accustomed to for the past 30 years is shifting fundamentally. So I don't have an answer yet because it's in motion, so heavily in motion right now, slow and fast at the same time.
Yeah, I'm struggling to think about what a decoupling would even look like. And there are multiple theater companies, at least in Toronto, that have an all Canadian mandate, and those are the companies that seem to be the most under threat right now, in terms of not being able to get an audience, not being able to maintain a season, and having to cancel programming. And they're also, the least celebrated at award shows. And I think there are many things that America does really well, and I think one of the things is that they have such a massive population, and so they're able to have a system and a network that creates theater, where theater can start in one really small theater and grow towards something else, and we don't have that same population or network. I also think that it's reframing the way an audience thinks about Canadian content, and really helping them to believe that that Canadian content matters, and so much and a lot of Canadian content is really new, that it doesn't have the same history as American content. And so I think the other thing is getting people to sign on to work that they might be completely unfamiliar with, and believe in it. But yeah, I'm struggling to again, think about what a decoupling looks like, but also whether or not we need to decouple. Like, I think that as people, I'm really interested in what brings us together actually as two countries. And I have many collaborators who are American, and I actually love working with them despite the frictions in our government. And so, yeah, I think those are my.
Yeah, let me just sort of tweak it a little bit. A sort of parallel case here is the internet being a default First Amendment space because it is subject to American infrastructure. And different countries have slightly different takes on the limits of free expression and what is permissible and so on. This is very similar to the way we approach culture. So it's not a complete decoupling. It's just a question of more agency in the selection, because the way that things are currently configured, we have handed over a great deal of our cultural life to Silicon Valley, and their interests are not ours. And they're sort of loosely affiliated with the American government, but how do we reclaim is really the question I'm asking. How do we set about reclaiming the parts that are important without a complete parting of the ways? And I think that Sascha was sort of gesturing in that direction, saying that this is a larger question than longer history.
And I think what will be very indicative is how the CUSMA, Canadian-US Mexico Free Trade Agreement negotiations will be held, because they started actually pre-NAFTA with the US and Mexico, US and Canada agreement, with the cultural exemptions, right? Where certain sectors, mostly the more commercially oriented sectors, were actually exempt from the free trade rule, just to protect sector from the more free market oriented way in which culture is being produced and consumed, and in the US. And I'll be very interested to see whether a form of that cultural exemption, which has made its way into any and all free trade agreement that um, Canada undertakes and is slipping in letters alongside CPTPP, I believe that's the one, and others, or more formally within the agreement. So I'm very curious to see whether this will actually be a point of negotiation, which it wasn't before. Though it came under, of course, we know the famous cases that came out in the late 90s that led to the Cultural Expression Convention at UNESCO that Canada spearheaded, and whether they were more publisher oriented, more publisher revenue oriented rather than art or expression oriented. Well, we can debate that, but certainly it's been in place, but whether that will actually come under fire in the negotiation, and the way in which this unfolds will be very telling to that extent.
We have a couple of questions from the audience, so I'm going to turn to Ange to share those with us. Ange?
Yeah, the first question is for Robin. They say, I have a question for Robin. You referred to a Supreme Court case. Was this in regard to one of your books? And if so, could you tell us whether the U.S. Supreme Court protected your free expression rights as an author?
Yeah, so the case, it's a case that began in Maryland, Montgomery County, Maryland, where a school district had done some community consultation and decided to add some more books to the classrooms to reflect the diversity of the community that they were serving. And they selected 9 picture books, all with LGBTQ plus characters. And parents objected and ultimately filed a lawsuit with the help of the Becket Fund, which is a Christian law firm. And it was a case that hinged not on free expression, but on free exercise of religion. So they argued that the use of these books in the classroom infringed on their free exercise of religion, that they didn't want their kids being exposed to knowledge about LGBTQ plus people or community. And that case worked its way up through the courts and ended up at the Supreme Court. And we listened to the oral arguments live. I connected with the other authors and illustrators whose books were involved in the case, and we listened to the oral arguments live back in April. And it was very clear very quickly that the conservative majority on the court was going to find in favor of the religious plaintiffs and against the school district that wanted to use the books. There was a lot of misinformation about the books that was repeated in those oral arguments. And it was bizarre to listen to, frankly, because these were picture books for very young kids. So, for example, one of the books, which is for first graders, is Uncle Bobby's Wedding, and Samuel Alito's interpretation of that book was so removed from the actual book itself. And it's kind of mind-boggling that a Supreme Court justice could not comprehend a book that was written for first graders. And then Neil Gorsuch described my picture book, which is an alphabet book about a dog at a pride parade, as being about bondage and sex work, neither of which obviously have anything to do with the book. So it was a surreal experience to listen to these arguments, and it was a 6-3 decision in favor of the religious parents in this case. If you're interested in reading about it, is Mahmoud v. Taylor is the case, and I think at this point now that ruling came down in June. So in this new school year now, school districts are trying to sort out how to move forward in light of this ruling. So there's a lot of analysis happening online around what this means, what schools can do, what schools are required to do. School districts trying to sort of navigate how they can continue to have diverse books in the classroom in the light of this ruling, and also questions about what else can parents object to if a teacher has to ask for parental consent or give parents the right to opt out of anything that conflicts with their religious beliefs. That could encompass all kinds of things. If a family doesn't think women should work outside the home, or if a family doesn't want their kid taught about evolution. I mean, there's really no limit to the things a parent might decide they don't want their kid to learn about. So it puts a huge burden on schools then to notify parents every time a subject might come up that a parent might object to. And a sort of fear, I guess, there is schools again choosing not to use books that they fear might cause an objection, rather than risk that backlash. And there has actually just been one lawsuit filed in I'm blanking on the name of the Lexington County. I'm blanking on where it is, by a father whose kid was in a class where 2 books were read, which he now feels his kids shouldn't have been exposed to those books. One of the books says that different families, some families have 2 moms, some families have grandparents, some families have whatever. It's just a very sort of broad picture book about different types of families. The other one is a book called All Are Welcome, which is a really lovely picture book. And apparently on one page, it has a picture of a woman who's pregnant and she's walking with another woman, which this father felt could imply that they were a lesbian couple, and therefore he thought his child shouldn't have been exposed to this. So he has now sued the school district. And these cases are now happening across the US of parents trying to use this court ruling to further remove diverse books from classrooms. I hope that answered your question.
Is there another question, Ange?
Yes. The next question is for Jordan. Jordan, sorry, they say, do you think some of Trump's attacks on the cultural sector is tapping into a lot of ordinary people's feelings of alienation from live theater and some other cultural institutions like ballet, opera, symphony, which they see as highbrow? In the 19th century, Shakespeare was immensely popular among working class patrons, both in Britain and in the United States. His plays were considered a form of mass entertainment enjoyed across all social classes. Why do you think forms of theater that were once popular have become seen as highbrow, and so many cultural institutions are now felt not to be for ordinary people, but for the elite culture?
Yeah, I think the question points to the answer in that um, that that a part of the attack is calling theater highbrow. That theater really is an art form that is for everyone, and many theater companies have failed to uh, understand that or to make that apparent. And so what has happened is that many companies um, have prices that are completely unaccessible to the general public. But there's also a lot of ways that companies have been really resistant to that. Many companies have really pay what you can days. Um, there are companies that have free showings, and so I think it's important to just double down on ways to make theater more accessible and for everyone.
And what's the next question?
Yeah, the next question is from Kim. Kim says, thank you, a very interesting panel from different perspectives. Could the panel comment on cultural boycotts? Do they raise awareness? Do they suffocate cultural and intellectual exchange? Do they further silence creators?
Who'd like to go first?
Who's boycotting whom
Yeah.
in that question? Directionality. Could you clarify the directionality of the question?
Well, there's the potential for a sort of arms race, isn't there? If the Americans put a tariff on something Canadian and then we escalate with it, there's sort of it doesn't matter ultimately, doesn't if culture becomes a sort of political um, battleground, then
It,
it doesn't really help. That's my view, anyway.
it's so interesting. Um, uh, I just got a reminder that the Buffalo game started, so there you go. So but I think it's different from not buying, US grown lettuce. Uh, but I think culturally it's very hard to disentangle. So there's been a study. What's the book called? Let's see, if I can- Cosmopolitan Communications, which I found super interesting, was published before the algorithms became what they were from 2010 onwards. So it's a bit dated study, but I think it's still valid. And the key conclusion is that unless you wish, and that's how am I interpreting it, unless you wish to live in North Korea, which is completely hermetically sealed, um, an open society needs to remain open. And I think cultural boycotts fly in the face of that. And what I indicated earlier is that Canadian cultural policy has been living with the assumption that the more we produce Canadian content, the more the population will be inoculated against content from the US. However, I strongly believe in people's choice when it comes to cultural consumption, that people can make their own judgment, that people are sophisticated enough to make a distinction or pick what they like. Um, as we've seen in polls recently, when the notion of the 51st state was raised, I did not see signs of willingness to be assimilated or annexed or in any way or shape or form, despite heavy consumption um, of American content or being glued to American television, to American platforms, or watching American sports. So I think the discussion needs to have quite a bit more nuance and a bit more analytical depth when it comes to these things. Um, so that's my offer here.
Anyone else? Okay, Angie, what's the next question?
Yeah, the next question says, is it surprising that populists have felt they can mobilize by attacking the arts, given the US and Canada do not value the arts? The percentage of government budgets for arts and culture is minuscule. Or looking at the average pay for one Toronto Raptors player, which is approximately $26.9 million for the 2025 season, whereas the average salary for an actor at the Stratford Festival, arguably Canada's most prominent theater, is an estimated $64,000 per year.
Who'd like to take that? I mean, part of the answer there goes back to that economic argument by Galbraith, I think. He said when you looked at the highest salary in the NBA, if you were to ask the number of people that watch that player during a year, would you pay $1 to see them? They would happily. So just on the scale of the audience, they're worth 26 million. But I'm not sure it's as straightforward as that. Anyone thoughts about that? No. Okay, well, I think we're coming to the end. Sascha, I did want to go back to this question of bad faith, which it seems to me lies at the heart of so many of the things that we have touched on here. There is an assumption, we tend to think in cultural arguments that people are motivated by principle. And I think that the post-2008 algorithmic culture that we've created has skewed that irreparably, and that people are now trolling. This is now a core aspect of the culture. And I wonder if we are doing ourselves a disservice by taking, I mean, Trump is probably the world's top troll in many ways. And if you respond to their agenda and their questions, are you sort of missing the real what's really at stake? We just did an event with Rachel Maddow and Rebecca Solnit, and Maddow said that one of the things she tried to do every day was not take the bait. That the administration floods the zone, and its intention is to control where you look and what you do. And if we're talking about resistance, cultural resistance, isn't part of that to decide for ourselves how we respond rather than engaging with people who are coming after us, so to speak, in bad faith? I wonder what your thoughts collectively are on that.
I absolutely agree with that. I think it's really important to think about where you're going to put your energy and what is actually effective in responding. With respect to book bans, book challenges for the most part play out locally, and there is actually lots people can do on a local level. And I think, voting in local elections, voting in school trustees, the number of people that show up to vote for school trustees is tiny, which makes it very easy for folks to get a far right candidate onto a school board where they can push this sort of agenda to ban books and so on, and to undermine LGBTQ rights in schools and all of that. But so voting in local elections, writing letters to government representatives, letting your local schools and libraries know that you oppose censorship, like proactively, just write them a letter and say, we really value the library, really glad you have a diverse collection, as a library user, I want you to know that I appreciate you standing against censorship. Get that out there so that when someone comes into the library and objects to something, they're not the only voices that are being heard. I think that is far more powerful than responding to trolls online, and to arguing with people who aren't engaging in good faith. I think look at your sphere of influence and where you can respond. We've a group of authors. We've just started a Canadian Authors and Illustrators Against Book Bans to talk about how can we respond as creators to book bans that are happening in Canada. Very much inspired by Authors Against Book Bans in the States, who've done a fantastic job pushing back against bans over the last few years, but are focused on bans in the US. So, and I know that, publishers, librarians, teachers are all having parallel conversations about how they can respond. And I think that, so many of these attacks, obviously aren't just about, this is not about the books, right? And it's about the identities and communities that these books represent. So I think speaking up in support of the communities whose rights are being attacked. And so whether that's challenging Islamophobia, xenophobia, anti-immigrant rhetoric, anti-LGBTQ, anti-trans rhetoric, that so many of these bans are actually rooted in these really hateful ideas. And it's not just about defending the books, it's about defending the people and the communities and the rights that are under threat. And again, thinking about how can you do that effectively, because it's not going to be engaging with trolls who are not engaging in good faith. It's looking at, where can you actually have some influence and using whatever privilege you have to try to make a difference. And I think also that like we said earlier, that this climate of fear that's being created, that's not a side effect, that is the goal. So just don't let yourself be silenced and continue to speak up. And I think that's one way we can minimize the impact.
Anyone else?
So I'm giving Jordan the last word here. So I'm jumping in there. If you, so I think the term that you use, bad faith, is very interesting. If I take the perspective of the liberal elite, member of the liberal elite that I am, that maybe we all are, I think we might see it as bad faith. It clearly displays a bad faith. But that might be an expression of the information environment that we inhabit collectively, rather than information environment of which the language that we've seen has been expressed to which there is an internal logic as well, if we inhabit that environment. So for me, the fundamental question is, how can we bridge those gaps as institutions? As an institution, who have we also left behind? We've left a lot of people behind, but who have we also neglected? How can we reach even more people? How can we form cross-sectoral alliances and responses to do our part to maybe change the information environment, be even more inclusive? And I think it's very hard to do under digital onslaught, but at least I think if we have a response across civil society and across borders, we might be able to maybe not change the dial, but tweak the dial. I'm not fatalistic or deterministic or in any of this. I think there is a response to be had, but I think it's looking at the fundamental assumption that underpin it. And I like to inhabit a space where I like to talk about this as prevention, right? There's not going to be a magic pill. It's not Ozempic. We're not going to get an Ozempic. And we don't even know how that's going to play out medically. We're all in this big live lab test in some ways. But I think we need to take a preventative approach.
Jordan, I'll let you have the last word, and then we go to Jim to close off.
Yeah, I can only simplify, but I agree with what others have said. There was a study done in the U.S. That looked at red states versus blue states, and what the study showed is that the red states had the least access to art. And what it demonstrated was that it's not necessarily them turning their backs on us, it's us turning our backs on them. And so, I think we do have a responsibility to think about, as Sascha's pointing to, how we bridge those gaps. But I think we also have a responsibility to ourselves to not further engage in the trolls that are that are happening right now, because that's part of how the narrative is getting exasperated, is that we participate in that narrative, and it grows and it flames.
Thank you. Jim?
Excuse me. Well, Robin and Sascha and Jordan and Brendan, I want to thank all four of you for a really interesting and stimulating discussion. And I want to thank our audience too for joining us tonight. What I'd like to do is tell you about our next event, which is going to be next Tuesday night, November 25th, again at 7 p.m. Eastern Time. And it's going to look at a quite disturbing but very different subject. And that is, there's been a series of the Carney government's first proposed laws, 4 out of the 7 of them, that undermine essential human rights and freedoms that have long been valued in Canada. We're going to be looking at those laws and what may appear to be isolated pieces of legislation form a broader picture of creeping restrictions on privacy, expression, and civic participation, which are essential in a democratic society. So we're having quite an impressive panel that will explore what these bills mean, why our government would be undermining fundamental human rights and civil liberties at this point in time, and what we can do about that, and are there better alternatives? So it's going to be a very interesting discussion. So next Tuesday night, November 7th at 7 p.m., I hope you'll join us again. We're going to be posting the video of tonight's panel discussion on the CFE website tomorrow. And we're also going to post with it some additional resources if you want to look into some of the things that were discussed tonight or related materials. We'll put up a link to the Supreme Court case that Robin talked about. We'll put up other materials. So if you're interested and you found the discussion valuable, please let your friends and network know about it. And as I say, it's on our website, which is cfe.torontomu.ca. And please go there yourself to look for some of these resources that I think you might find interesting. In any case, thank you all very much for tonight. Good night, everyone.